Washington, D.C., 2:45 p.m. The air inside the D.C. local courtroom was thick with tension. The wooden benches creaked under the shifting weight of restless spectators. People whispered in hushed tones, eyes flickering toward the young woman standing before the judge. Karoline Leavitt, the 27-year-old White House press secretary, stood tall in the defendant's stand, her sharp blue eyes locked onto the judge. A small silver cross gleamed on the collar of her blazer under the harsh fluorescent lights, an accessory so small, yet the very reason she was being fined. "Miss Leavitt," Judge Charles Hargrove's voice cut through the courtroom like a knife. His sharp, narrow eyes peered down at her, dripping with authority. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, then slammed his gavel down. "You are in direct violation of courtroom neutrality. That religious symbol on your neck is not permitted. You will be fined $500. Pay it before you leave." The courtroom fell silent. A murmur rippled through the crowd, confused, shocked, some even outraged. Karoline didn't move. Her pulse pounded in her ears, but she remained composed. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on a man in an "I Am King" t-shirt and a woman wearing an oversized diamond necklace. Both sat untouched. Her grip on her phone tightened. This isn't about neutrality. This is personal. She took a slow, deliberate step forward. "Your Honor, what law have I violated?" Hargrove's fingers curled around his gavel. His expression darkened. "Do not question my authority, Miss Leavitt. Pay the fine and sit down." Karoline's jaw tightened. He has no idea who he just challenged. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Karoline Leavitt remained standing, her hands resting lightly on the wooden table before her. Her sharp gaze never wavered from Judge Charles Hargrove, whose expression was carved with authority, but also something else, something personal. She could feel it. The way he clutched the gavel too tightly, the slight hesitation in his voice, the way he avoided looking directly at her cross. This wasn't about court rules, this was about control. Across the room, a middle-aged woman wearing an enormous, shimmering diamond necklace sat comfortably beside her lawyer. To the right, a young man in a graphic t-shirt with bold red lettering reading "I Am King" slouched in his seat, scrolling through his phone. Not a single word had been said about their attire. But Karoline, a woman who had served at the highest level of the White House, who had advised the President of the United States, who had stood at podiums fielding the toughest political attacks, was being fined for a cross the size of a dime. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to remain calm. This was bigger than her. Judge Hargrove cleared his throat. "Miss Leavitt, I will not ask again. Pay the fine, or you will be held in contempt." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others took out their phones, recording discreetly. Karoline took a slow breath. Every crisis has a strategy. She turned slightly, catching the gaze of James Wilson, the court bailiff, who stood near the bench, arms crossed, his face unreadable, but his eyes, they held something. Understanding? Doubt? She looked back at the judge. "Your Honor, I respectfully request to see the specific written rule that prohibits my cross in this courtroom." Judge Hargrove's nostrils flared. He leaned forward, resting both elbows on his desk. His lips twitched in irritation. He didn't have a rule. Karoline knew it. Everyone in the courtroom knew it. Yet, he doubled down. "This is my courtroom, Miss Leavitt. I set the rules." A murmur rippled through the spectators. People were listening now, closely. Karoline tilted her head slightly, scanning the room once more. The young man in the t-shirt smirked, entertained. The woman with the necklace whispered something to her lawyer, as if even she found this absurd. Karoline took another step forward. So, it's not the law you're enforcing, it's your opinion. A sharp, collective gasp filled the room. Judge Hargrove's eyes flashed. He slammed his gavel down so hard that Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, jumped in her seat. "Enough!" his voice thundered. "You will pay the fine now!" Karoline didn't flinch. She kept her voice steady, cold as steel. "No!" The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, camera phones flashing. Judge Hargrove's face burned red. He banged his gavel again, his hand visibly shaking now. Karoline met his gaze, her chin held high. She could feel it, the shift. The judge had made a mistake, and it was too late to stop what was coming. The air in the courtroom had shifted. It was no longer just a case, it was a spectacle. Karoline stood her ground, her shoulders squared, her breath steady. Across from her, Judge Hargrove's face burned red, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for a way out. He had no idea who he was dealing with. "Miss Leavitt," his voice came low and sharp, "I am ordering you right now to pay the fine, or I will have you removed." A hush fell over the room. Karoline let the silence stretch. She wanted him to feel the weight of the moment. Then, without breaking eye contact, she pulled her White House press badge from her bag and placed it on the podium. The golden emblem of the United States glimmered under the courtroom lights. A flicker of doubt flashed across Hargrove's face. "I serve the President of the United States, Your Honor. I am not some reckless lawbreaker. I know my rights." Gasps rippled through the spectators. Judge Hargrove's lips pressed into a thin line. "Your title means nothing in my courtroom." "Neither does your opinion," Karoline shot back. The tension cracked like thunder. Hargrove's fingers curled around the gavel, his knuckles turning white. He was losing control, and he knew it. The courtroom doors swung open as two officers entered. The bailiff, James Wilson, stood still near the judge's bench, watching everything unfold with sharp eyes. The judge lifted his gavel. "I am giving you one last chance. Pay the fine or be arrested for contempt." Karoline exhaled slowly. Then she reached into her bag. A few people gasped, expecting her to finally pull out her wallet. Instead, she pulled out a legal document, a copy of the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. She placed it on the desk in front of her. The entire courtroom went silent. Judge Hargrove's eyes flickered toward it, his jaw tightening. Karoline's voice was calm, deliberate. "Do you want to read it out loud, or should I?" A suppressed chuckle came from the back row. The judge's cheeks flushed with rage. "You think you're clever?" "Number 2, I think I'm right." The whispers in the courtroom grew louder. Judge Hargrove looked at the bailiff. "James, remove her from this courtroom." James Wilson didn't move. For the first time in 15 years of working under Judge Hargrove, Wilson refused to follow an order. The judge's eyes widened. His hands trembled slightly as he turned to the officers who had just arrived. "Arrest her." The two officers hesitated. Karoline slowly lifted her phone, turning the screen toward the room. The recording was still running. The judge's face drained of color. Gasps, murmurs, a spark of chaos ignited. This wasn't just a courtroom dispute anymore. This was something bigger. Judge Hargrove's authority was crumbling before everyone's eyes. A voice rang out from the back. A woman stood up. "Your Honor, I was fined for a cross last year too." More whispers. Another person rose to their feet. "And I was fined for wearing a prayer badge." Judge Hargrove's eyes darted around the courtroom. "Sit down!" he barked. But they didn't. More and more people stood up, their voices rising. Karoline didn't have to say anything. The courtroom was speaking for her. The judge had lost. Judge Hargrove gripped his gavel so tightly his fingers turned pale. He banged it against the desk, his voice breaking. "Order! Order in the court!" But the courtroom was no longer under his control. Karoline took a step forward. "Your Honor, you have selectively enforced an unwritten rule. You've targeted people based on their faith. That is not neutrality, it is discrimination." Judge Hargrove's breathing became uneven. Karoline continued, her voice unwavering. "And thanks to this recording, the world will see it." The judge looked at the camera phones aimed at him. The expressions of the people he once controlled. His gavel hung useless in his hand. His career was unraveling right in front of him. The judge's shoulders slumped. The weight of the moment dragged him down like an anchor. James Wilson, the bailiff, stepped forward, not toward Karoline, but toward the judge. "Sir," his voice was measured, "perhaps it's time we adjourned." The judge blinked. For the first time he looked afraid. He glanced at Karoline, then at the First Amendment paper on the desk. His courtroom had turned against him. With a shaky breath, he dropped the gavel. The courtroom burst into whispers as Judge Hargrove stood up and walked out. He didn't say a word. He didn't even look back. And just like that, his reign was over. The moment the judge disappeared through the back doors, the room erupted. Applause, cheers, people talking over one another. Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, frantically typed everything, knowing this moment would go down in history. James Wilson, the bailiff, approached Karoline. For the first time, he smiled. "That was one hell of a fight, Miss Leavitt." Karoline picked up the First Amendment document, sliding it back into her bag. She had won. But she wasn't done yet. The world needed to hear about this. She checked her phone. The recording had already been uploaded. Hundreds of comments were flooding in. A single notification popped up. The president had just called. Karoline's smile grew. She knew what was coming next. And Judge Hargrove? His nightmare was only beginning. Washington, D.C., 3:10 p.m. The courtroom buzzed with energy long after Judge Hargrove had fled the bench. The gavel that once commanded order now lay abandoned on his desk, useless and forgotten. Karoline took a slow breath, steadying herself. She wasn't just standing in a courtroom anymore. She was standing at the center of a moment that was about to explode beyond these walls. Her phone vibrated. She glanced down, a message from the White House. "Do not leave the courthouse. We are moving on this now." Karoline's pulse quickened. This wasn't just about her anymore. She turned to face the crowd. People were still murmuring, processing what had just happened. Some were filming, their phones pointed toward her. Others whispered excitedly, eyes wide. The courtroom clerk, Mrs. Thompson, wiped her palms against her skirt. Her fingers trembled. James Wilson, the bailiff, folded his arms, watching her closely. He knew. Everyone in this room knew. This wasn't just a moment of defiance. This was history. Meanwhile, in a private office inside the courthouse, Judge Hargrove sat at his desk, his fingers trembling against his coffee cup. His phone had been buzzing non-stop. Calls from the Judicial Council, calls from reporters. His career, his reputation, was crumbling. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to process what had just happened. He had lost control of his courtroom, and worse, he had lost it on camera. Judge Hargrove swallowed, his throat dry. He turned on his phone and opened X, formerly Twitter. Crossing Court was trending, thousands of comments. Judge Hargrove just illegally fined a woman for wearing a cross. This is unconstitutional. Fire him. Karoline Leavitt didn't just fight for herself. She fought for every American who believes in religious freedom. Where's the accountability? This judge needs to be investigated. His hand trembled. Then the final blow. A new notification appeared. Breaking. The White House releases official statement condemning Judge Hargrove's actions. Judge Hargrove's breath hitched. He scrolled, his vision blurring. President Trump had tweeted. The attack on religious freedom in D.C. today was disgraceful. Karoline Leavitt stood strong in the face of injustice, and we will not let this go unanswered. The fight has just begun. Religious freedom. 50,000 retweets in 20 minutes. Judge Hargrove's face turned pale. This wasn't just a mistake. This was the end. Karoline's phone buzzed again. She lifted it to see an incoming call. White House senior advisor. She picked up. Karoline. The voice on the other end was sharp and controlled. The president wants you to speak. Now. Karoline's stomach tightened. She exhaled. I understand. She ended the call and lifted her chin. It was time. She stepped toward the podium at the front of the courtroom. The cameras were on her now. Her voice was steady. What happened here today was not just about me. This is about every American who has been silenced, fined, or punished for practicing their faith. Today, a judge tried to use his power to intimidate and suppress. She glanced at the camera phones. But we do not back down. Not today, not ever. The courtroom erupted into applause. This wasn't just a victory. This was a movement, and it was only getting started. Washington, D.C., 5 p.m. The courthouse was no longer just a building. It was now the center of a national movement. Outside, reporters lined the streets, microphones in hand, cameras rolling. Protesters and supporters had gathered, holding signs that read, "Religious freedom is a right, not a privilege. Fire Judge Hargrove. Karoline Leavitt stood, so we stand with her." Karoline stood on the courthouse steps, the golden glow of the setting sun casting long shadows behind her. Her phone buzzed. Again. Judge Hargrove has been suspended indefinitely. The Judicial Council is launching an investigation. She read the message twice, letting it sink in. It was over. Judge Hargrove's reign was finished. Judge Hargrove's last moments in power. Inside the courthouse, Hargrove sat alone in his office, staring at his phone screen. Breaking. D.C. Judicial Council announces full review of Hargrove's past rulings for signs of bias. His hands clenched into fists. He had spent 30 years on the bench. And now, his name would forever be remembered, not for his career, but for his fall. A knock at his door. The court clerk, Mrs. Thompson, stepped in. She held a file in her hands. "Judge Hargrove, they want you in the council room, now." He nodded, rising to his feet. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the one in control. A victory that sparked change. Later that evening, Karoline sat in her office, the glow of her laptop screen reflecting in her eyes. Her phone buzzed, another email from the White House senior team. "The President wants you to lead a policy discussion on judicial accountability. Be ready." She exhaled, running a hand over the small framed document on her desk, the $500 fine receipt. She had never paid it. She never would. Because now, the system had paid her instead, and it had learned a lesson it would never forget. Justice had been served, and Karoline Leavitt had made history. What just happened in that courtroom wasn't just a legal battle, it was a fight for justice. Karoline Leavitt stood up against a corrupt system, and in doing so, she didn't just defend herself, she defended the rights of millions. This is more than a story. It's a wake-up call. How many more judges like Hargrove are out there? How many people have been silenced, fined, or punished just for standing by their faith? If Karoline had backed down, this would have been just another forgotten injustice. But she fought back, and she won. What would you have done in her place? Comment below and let us know. And if you believe in standing up for what's right, if you believe in exposing corruption, and if you want to see more real stories that challenge the system, hit that like button and subscribe right now. Every time you watch, like, and share, you help bring stories like this to light. Turn on notifications so you never miss the truth. We are just getting started. See you in the next video.